Bit of ASMR to start. Oh, yep, that's the paper turning. So we're on page 86, moral sense. Another area where analytic retrospection misleads us as to the nature of what we are seeing, since it reconstructs the world according to the left hemisphere principles, is that of morality. Moral values are not something that we work out rationally on the principle of utility or any other principle for that matter, but are irreducible aspects of the phenomenal world, like color. So morality is like color. I agree with Max Sischler, and for that matter with Wittgenstein, that moral value is a form of experience irreducible to any other kind, or accountable for any other terms. And I believe this perception underlies Kant's derivation of God from the existence of moral values, rather than moral values from the existence of a God. Such values are linked to the capacity for empathy, not reasoning, and moral judgments are not deliberative, but conscious and intuitive, deeply bound up with our emotional sensitivity to others. Empathy is intrinsic to morality. Empathy is intrinsic to morality. I like that. Patients with lesions, so I think that meant areas cut in the brain, or basically a damaged area, in the ventromedial frontal lobes are impulsive, fail to foresee consequences, and are emotionally disengaged from others. In particular, the right ventromedial frontal cortex, which has rich interconnections with limbic structures, is critical to every aspect of moral and social behavior. Moral judgment involves a complex right hemisphere network, particularly the right ventromedial and orbitofrontal cortex, as well as the amygdala in both hemispheres. Damage in the right prefrontal cortex may lead to frank psychopathic behavior. Our sense of justice is underwritten by the right hemisphere, particularly by the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. With inactivation of this area, we act more selfishly. This is probably related to the right frontal lobe's capacity to see others' points of view, and for empathy in general. I will discuss the relation between altruism and the right hemisphere in Chapter 4. The right frontal lobe's capacity to inhibit our natural impulse to selfishness means that it is also the area on which we most rely for self-control and the power to resist temptation. I think we can also make a connection here with a rather fundamental difference between the hemispheres. The left hemisphere's stickiness, its tendency to recur what it is familiar with, tends to reinforce whatever it is already doing. There is a reflexivity to the process, as if trapped in a hall of mirrors. It only discovers more of what it already knows, and it only does more of what it already is doing. The right hemisphere, by contrast, seeing more of the picture and taking a broader perspective that characteristically includes both its own and the left hemispheres, is more reciprocally inclined and more likely to espouse another point of view. One way of thinking of this is in terms of feedback systems. Most biological systems seek homeostasis. If they move too far in one direction, they stabilize themselves by self-correction. This is negative feedback, the most familiar example of which is the operation of a thermostat. If the temperature consistently tends to drop, the thermostat triggers a heating system that will act to bring the temperature back to the desired level. However, systems can become unstable and enter a situation in which positive feedback obtains. In other words, a move in one direction rather than producing a move in the opposite direction serves to promote further moves in that same direction, and a snowballing effect occurs. The right hemisphere then is capable of freeing us through negative feedback. Okay. The left hemisphere tends to positive feedback and we can become stuck, so going in the same direction. This is not unlike the difference between the normal drinker and the addict. After a certain point, the normal drinker begins to feel less like another drink. What makes an addict is the lack of an off switch. Another drink only makes the next more likely. And interestingly enough, lesions of the frontolimbic systems, mainly in the right hemisphere, are associated with addictive behavior. Lesions in the front. So if you have damage to your right, it's more associated to addictive behavior. Pathological gamblers, for example, have frontal deficits which are mainly right-sided. By contrast, in cocaine addicts, for example, stimulating the right prefrontal cortex reduces cravings for cocaine, and denial, a left hemisphere specialty, is typical of addiction. Cafe. I want a beer. I want a fucking. Because I'm now comfortable talking into the mic. That's what I do. I speak into the mic. New chapter. The self. Oh, sorry. New subheading. The self. Conscious awareness of the self is a surprisingly late development in evolution. The higher apes, such as chimpanzees and orangutans, are capable of self-recognition, but monkeys are not. They failed the mirror test. The right prefrontal region is critically involved in self-recognition, whether by face or by voice. Imagine studies of self-recognition by face or voice confirms the importance of the right frontal region and the right cingulate cortex. An important correlate of the self-awareness in humans is the correct use of the personal pronouns, I and me, which is lacking in autism, a condition which replicates many right hemisphere deficits. Clearly, no one hemisphere can on its own constitute the self. The self is a complex concept, but in brief, the self as intrinsically, empathetically inseparable from the world in which it stands in relation to others, and the continuous sense of self are more dependent on the right hemisphere, whereas the objectified self and the self as an expression of will is generally more dependent on the left hemisphere. Some studies in split brain subjects suggest a right hemisphere advantage for self-recognition, but others reveal that both hemispheres equally can recognize the self objectively, though the right hemisphere has an advantage for recognizing familiar others. The personal interior sense of self, with a history and a personal and emotional memory, as well as what it is, rather confusingly, sometimes called the self-concept, appears to be dependent to a very large extent on the right hemisphere. The self-concept is impaired by the right hemisphere injury. The self-concept is impaired by right hemisphere injury, wherever in the right hemisphere it may occur, but the right frontal region is of critical importance here. This could be described as self-experience. The right hemisphere seems more engaged by emotion, autobiographical memories. It is hardly surprising that the sense of self should be grounded on the right hemisphere, because the self originates in the interaction with the other. Oh. The sense of self emerges from the activity of the brain in interaction with other cells. The right orbitofrontal cortex, the part of the right frontal lobe most crucial for social and empathetic understanding, is larger in primates than the left. It is likely that this part of the brain expands during the period of playful interaction between infants and mother in the second half of the first year, and the second year of life, during which the sense of self emerges. So this is the gaining consciousness meme, basically, is when it starts in that year and a half mark to 2 years. Emerges. And indeed, the right orbitofrontal cortex is seen by Alan Shaw as the crucible of the growing self. The right hemisphere matures earlier than the left hemisphere and is more involved than the left in almost every aspect of the development of mental functioning in early childhood and of the self as a social, empathetic being. Social development in the infant takes place independently of language development, another pointer to its right hemisphere origins. The relationship between the evolution of a sense of self and the sense of others as beings like oneself, and therefore as evoking empathy and understanding, which I have referred to before as an achievement of the right frontal lobes, is born out of by the close relationship between the development of a sense of self and the development of theory of mind. This, for example, evidenced by the fact that the neuroimaging correlates of both self-awareness and theory of mind lie in the right right frontal and right cingulate cortex. It is also the right hemisphere which is responsible for maintaining a coherent, continuous, and unified sense of self. Evidence from patients with dementia is highly suggestive that it is the right hemisphere that connects the individual to emotionally salient experiences and memories underlying self schemas, and which therefore forms the glue holding together the sense of self. The remark is reminiscent of the formulation of Douglas Watts that emotion binds together virtually every type of information the brain can encode. Emotion binds together virtually every type of information the brain can encode. It is part of the glue that holds the whole system together. And indeed, to the degree that it is true, the observation that the right hemisphere binds together the sense of self would follow from this. And as already implied in the brief discussion of the hemispheres and time, it is the right prefrontal cortex, in conjunction with its reciprocal connections with other cortical and subcortical structures, which enables human adults to see themselves as just that, selves, with continuous existence over time. Right frontal damage impairs the sense of self over time. Self with a narrative and a continuous flow-like existence. Sperry and his colleagues hypothesized that it is the right hemisphere network that gives rise to self-awareness. The right hemisphere is preferentially involved in the processing of self-images, at least when self-images are not consciously perceived. The right hemisphere is preferentially involved in the processing of self-images, at least when self-images are not consciously perceived. In particular, a right frontoparietal network in the human brain seems critical for the distinguishing the self from others. Activation in the right inferior and medial parietal region, namely the anterior precuneus and posterior cingulate cortex, is proportionate to the degree that stimulate and perceive as referring to the self. When subjects look at an image of their own face, activation is seen in the right hemisphere, especially at the right, occipitotemporoparietal. Fuck, I actually nailed that. Occipitotemporoparietal junction and in the right frontal operculum. That one sounded Turkish. Individuals that may neglect or misidentify their own hands and feet when the right hemisphere, but not when the left hemisphere, is damaged or temporarily inactivated. Somatognosia, the condition in which subjects fail to recognize their embodied self or parts of their body, is found in nearly 90% of subjects following any right hemisphere stroke. And conversely, the condition appears to be associated only with right hemisphere deficits. Feinberg, who has made a study of the condition, notes that 100 cases known to him, not once has it followed the left hemisphere damage. So very deeply is the sense of self from the right hemisphere. In keeping with this, those with damage to the right frontotemporal cortex may experience a cognitive detachment from self. When subjects read a first-person narrative, they activate the precuneus and anterior cingulate cortex bilaterally, but also preferentially the right temporoparietal junction compared with reading a third-person narrative. Philosophers spend a deal of time inspecting and analyzing processes that are usually and perhaps must remain implicit, unconscious, intuitive, in other words, examining the life of the right hemisphere from the standpoint of the left. It is perhaps then not surprising that the glue begins to disintegrate, and there is a nasty cracking noise as the otherwise normally robust sense of self comes apart, possibly revealing more about the merits or otherwise of the process than the self under scrutiny. Schizophrenics, like philosophers, have a problem with the sense of self which ordinary individuals involved with living lack. I'm going to repeat that. Schizophrenics, like philosophers, have a problem with the sense of self which ordinary individuals involved with living lack. Have a problem. As Wittgenstein once remarked, it's strange that in ordinary life we are not troubled by the feeling that the phenomenon is slipping away from us, the constant flux of appearance, but only when we philosophize. This indicates that what is in question here is an idea suggested by a misapplication of our language. Could this be read as the misapplication of language? In other words, the faulty procedure of seeking truth by standing in the world of the left hemisphere while looking at the world of the right. One recent elegant experiment underlines the key role played by the right hemisphere in the recognition of the self, and at the same time emphasizes the left hemisphere's affinity with public rather than personal knowledge. Using the WADA test, each subject was shown a computer-generated picture of the subject's own face morphed with that of a person famous in public life. Interesting. After the anesthetic wore off, the subject were then shown the separate pictures of the famous person and of themselves, and were asked which more closely resembled the picture they had previously seen. This is weird. Those who had viewed the picture with their right hemisphere chose the picture of themselves. Those who viewed it with their left hemisphere chose the picture of the famous person. What the fuck? In this study, 9 out of 10 cases conformed to this pattern. Wow. Although there is one, I have no idea what this word is, commissaritomy, split brain, case reported that appears to suggest the opposite. Virtually all other evidence points to the key role of the right hemisphere in self-recognition. All right, now ASMR paper turn. Oh yeah. We got a page and a half for this subheading. I think we're doing well. Stay with me. Stay with me. The right frontal region appears to be essential for the determination of self in the other modalities too, such as voice recognition. Damage to the right parietal and medial regions may result in confusions of self with other. Damage to the right frontal lobe creates a disturbance of ego boundaries, suggesting that the right hemisphere, particularly the right frontal region, under normal circumstances, plays a crucial role in establishing the appropriate relationship between the self and the world. It is this region that is so obviously not functioning properly in schizophrenia, where subjects not only lack empathy, humor, metaphorical understanding, pragmatics, social skills, and theory of mind, but crucially mistake the boundaries of self and other, even at times feeling themselves to melt into other individuals, or that other beings are invading or occupying their own body space. Important aspects of self-awareness in the sense of how we are likely to seem or come across to others, akin to insight, also depends on the right hemisphere. The capacity to understand oneself as a human being like others, which is involved in self-awareness, is an aspect of the human ability to identify with others, empathize with them, and share their feelings, dependent, as we have seen, on the right hemisphere. The right inferior parietal lobule plays a crucial role both in planning and monitoring the outcomes of one's own actions. It was one of the earliest perceptions that the left hemisphere is the seat of conscious self-awareness, certainly for the expression of its selfhood through the conscious will. I have already suggested that the expression of the will, in the sense of the conscious, rational will, grasping and manipulating, may have been responsible for the expansion of the left hemisphere. Nonetheless, it turns out that when we are acting for ourselves, in the sense of initiating new action rather than following another's lead, the activity is largely in the right hemisphere. Though this may be restricted to practical habitual actions, there is a tendency for the independence and motivation to be associated with the right hemisphere and passivity with left hemisphere. Passivity. This is related to its stickiness described above, its relative inability to shift set, espouse a new way of looking at things rather than getting locked down into environmental cues. Environmental dependency syndrome refers to an inability to inhibit automatic responses to environmental cues. It is also known as forced utilization behavior. Individuals displaying such behavior will, for example, pick up a pair of glasses that are not their own and put them on, just because they are lying on the table. Involuntarily pick up a pen and paper. Involuntarily pick up a pen and paper and start writing, or passively copy the behavior of the examiner without asking to, even picking up a stethoscope and pretending to use it. According to Kenneth Haleman, the syndrome, as well as abulia (bracket loss of will), or akinesia, which is failure to move, and impersistence, which is the inability to carry through an action, are all commoner after right rather than left frontal damage. In 4 of the 5 cases of environmental dependency in Lehermet's classic paper, in which the syndrome was first described, the only or principal lesion was in the right frontal lobe. In each case, the patient explained that you held out objects to me. I thought I had to use them. However, the situation is far from straightforward. Since my reading of further data provided by Lehermet is that the syndrome is as common after lesions in either frontal lobe. And a lesion in either frontal lobe may, in any case, release behavioral patterns, characteristic of the posterior hemisphere on the same side. See below. As much as impair the functioning of the hemisphere as a whole, or indeed the contralateral hemisphere via the corpus callosum, but it would be in keeping with other research that shows forced utilization behavior after right hemisphere damage. One patient not only showed exaggerated response to external cues, utilization behavior, and motor impersistence, but a right-handed instinctive grasp reaction after an infarct in the infarct. Hey Siri, what does infarct mean?
Which word?
Oh,
M.
no.
Okay, I found this on the web
Siri,
for no. Check.
what does infarct mean?
Infarct means
Oh,
a small localized area of dead tissue resulting from failure of blood supply.
thank you.
No problem.
Yes, so they've been infarct. Yeah, absolutely fact. So I'm trying to find where I was. Infarct in the right thalamus, which was associated with underperfusion of the entire right cerebral cortex, especially in the frontal area. In reality, we are a composite of the 2 hemispheres, and despite the interesting results of experiments designed artificially to separate their functioning, they work together most of the time at the everyday level. But that does not at all exclude that they may have radically different agendas, and over long time periods and large numbers of individuals, it becomes apparent that they each instantiate a way of being in the world that is at conflict with the other. CODA, the front-back problem. I mentioned at the beginning of this chapter that there was one intrahemispheric rather than interhemispheric regional difference that I needed to refer to. This involves the relationship of the frontal lobes, the most highly evolved and the most distinctly human of all regions of the brain, with the processes going on elsewhere in the brain, including the posterior cortex, which they exist to exert control over. The frontal lobes achieve what they achieve largely through what it is normally described as inhibition of the posterior part of the same hemisphere. It might be better described, however, especially in the case of the right hemisphere, as modulation. The inhibitory effect is significantly more pronounced in the case of the left hemisphere, perhaps in keeping with its less integrated, more black and white style. This relationship between front and back is another example of paired opponent processes, enabling fine modulation of response. What do I mean by modulation? A process that resists but does not negate. It is best thought of as an imposition of necessary distance or delay, enabling something new to come forward. In this way, it is like the apparently antagonistic relationship of the 2 hemispheres, a topic which I will explore at length later in this book. It is neither that the products of one hemisphere negate the products of the other, nor that in some bland sense they merely complement one another. Their incompatibility permits instead, in a dialectical synthesis, something new to arise. To take an example, if the right hemisphere's immediacy of association with emotion and the body leads to its priorities, what is blah, 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 blah. To take an example, if the right hemisphere's immediacy of association with emotion and the body leads to take their incompatibility permits instead, in a dialectical synthesis, something new to arise. To take an example, if the right hemisphere's immediacy of association with emotion and the body leads it to prioritize what is close, what is mine, the right frontal lobe brings distance and delay to espousing my position. As a result, it enables others to stand forth as individuals like me. It enables a broader empathy and the beginning of altruism. This is not a negation of something by the frontal lobe, but a modulation of it, an unpacking, if you like, of something that was there all along, albeit in germ only, something that comes to life only when a degree of necessary distance is interposed. Or to take one example, this time from the left hemisphere, the relative detachment from the body displayed by the left hemisphere and its tendency to abstraction normally serve its purposeful striving towards the relative detachment from the body displayed by the left hemisphere and its tendency to abstraction normally serve its purposeful striving towards individual gain. The left frontal lobe, however, brings distance and allows to experience of the peaceful detachment from the material realm and emptying out, described by experts in meditation as a mystical experience. Again, this is no negation, but an elaboration of what left hemisphere affords. This is not likely to be a God spot in the brain. Not likely to be a God spot in the brain. And the area is fraught with problems of terminology and methodology, but there are areas that are often implicated as accompaniments of religious experience. An apparently cautious and objective review of the literature to date by Michael Trimble concludes that there is a slow accumulation of evidence in favor of religious experience being more closely linked with the non-dominant hemisphere, especially the posterior right hemisphere, temporoparietal region. But to illustrate my point, the other region that is implicated lies in the left frontal lobe, especially because of its power to inhibit the posterior left hemisphere, the temporoparietal region, the seat of language, and the sequential analysis. Now, we come to the conclusion of chapter 2. The literature on brain function, the literature on brain function is enormously, This book gets hard and my brain just gives up. Conclusion. The literature on brain function is enormously extensive and increasing geometrically with every passing day. This chapter cannot, in the nature of things, pretend to be an exhaustive review. To achieve that alone would require a team of experts and a book several times the size of this one. It's a big book. Rather, it is designed to highlight the differences between the hemispheres, where there is coherent evidence, and particularly to reverse the entrenched prejudice that, while the right hemisphere may add a bit of color to life, it is the left hemisphere that does serious business, with the admittedly hugely important exception of explicit manipulation involving language and serial analysis. The left hemisphere is not the dominant hemisphere. Language and analysis will form the subject of the next chapter. What I have tried here to convey is the sheer extent and something of the feel of our dependence on the right hemisphere, all of which stands in complete contrast to the view of it as the silent hemisphere. This and the still current sobriquet, the minor hemisphere, should make us think about the way in which we view ourselves. We are so used to focusing on utility and function that the fact that the right hemisphere damage may completely alter the way in which we stand in relation to the world and fundamentally change our mode of being has gone until recently virtually unnoticed. Indeed, at the risk of appearing to allow the left hemisphere even less to walk away with, I should point out that there is evidence that even those of the highest verbal as well as spatial ability probably rely to a greater extent on the right hemisphere. Perhaps inevitably following from that, it turns out that those of the highest intelligence, whatever their discipline are, may do so. Ultimately, if the left hemisphere is the hemisphere of what, the right Ultimately, if the left hemisphere is the hemisphere of what, the right hemisphere with its preoccupation with context, the relation of aspects of experience, emotion, and the nuances of expression could be said to be the hemisphere of how. This perhaps explains why conventional neuroscience, being itself largely a manifestation of the left hemisphere activity, has focused so much on what the brain is doing in which hemisphere, not in what way it does it in each hemisphere. Thus, in my view, missing the significance of what it is trying to understand. Before embarking on this chapter, I suggested that there were two ways of being in the world, both of which were essential. One was to allow things to be present to us in all their embodied particularity, with all their changeability and impermanence and their interconnectedness as part of a whole which is forever in flux. In this world, we too feel connected to what we experience. Part of the whole, not confined in subjective isolation from a world that is viewed as objective. The other was to step outside the flow of experience and experience our experience in a special way. Let's try that again. The other was to step outside of the flow of experience and experience our experience in a special way, to represent the world in a form that is less truthful but apparently clearer, and therefore cast in a form which is more useful for manipulation of the world and one another. This world is explicit, abstracted, compartmentalized, fragmented, static, though its bits can be reset in motion like a machine, essentially lifeless. From this world we feel detached, but in relation to it we are powerful. I believe the essential difference between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere is that the right hemisphere pays attention to the other, whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, which it sees itself in a profound relation. It is deeply attracted to and given life by the relationship, the betweenness that exists with this and the other. By contrast, the left hemisphere pays attention to the virtual world that it has created, which is self-consistent but self-contained, ultimately disconnected from the other, making it powerful, but ultimately only able to operate on and to know itself. However, as I also emphasized at the outset, both hemispheres take part in virtually all functions to some extent, and in reality, both are always engaged. I do not wish to leave the impression that it might be a good thing if the entire population had a left hemisphere stroke. I take it for granted that the contributions made by the left hemisphere to language and systematic thought in particular are invaluable. Our talent for division, for seeing the parts, is of staggering importance. Second, only to our capacity to transcend it in order to see the whole. These gifts of the left hemisphere have helped us achieve nothing less than civilization itself, with all that means, means. Even if we could abandon them, which of course we can't, we would be fools to do so and would come off infinitely the poorer. There are siren voices that call us to do exactly that, certainly to abandon clarity and precision, which in any case importantly depend on both hemispheres, and I want to emphasize that I am passionately opposed to them. We need the ability to make fine discriminations and to use reason appropriately. These contributions need to be made in the service of something else that only the right hemisphere can bring. Alone they are destructive, and right now they may be bringing us closer to forfeiting the civilization they helped us create. That's a fucking grim ending to that chapter. It's only taken me about a year and a half, but I've made it to chapter 3. Chapter 3, language, truth, and music. I think we save that for another time because my brain is mush. Peace.